Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm Abby McHugh-Griffa, Executive Director of the Climate Solutions Accelerator. I'm going to pull up our slides for tonight. It's really good to see so many familiar faces here and really appreciate the time you are taking on a Tuesday evening to hang out with us and learn about this climate action strategy that we've put together with the help of a lot of people. So this is our public input session. Here's our little agenda for tonight. I'm welcoming you right now, of course. So the bulk of this is going to be an overview of the strategy itself. And I will warn you that it might not be the most riveting presentation that we have ever given as an organization, because there is just a lot of meat in this strategy. We thought about how to present it in a way that would be really engaging. And at the end of the day, we decided, you know what, we really just need to go through a lot of nitty-gritty details so we don't, kind of gloss over important information that people will want to know about. Of course, I would push you to look at the entire document, the draft document. I think Kristen has done an amazing job of really crafting this vision for the region that is quite inspiring, and then showing how we can get to a better place in environmental terms and more. So really the entire document probably will make more sense than just the mitigation measures that we're going to be going through in detail tonight. But glad you're here. And again, we want to kind of provide different ways for people to learn about this and weigh in on it. So we do have the draft up on the website. There is a comment form you can fill out there. For those who would like to just say their input tonight, we will have time after the presentation for that. And then we'll be talking about some next steps. So again, if you've kind of seen the news recently, you will have noticed that the IPCC just came out with another report outlining the doom and gloom of climate and what it means globally. But I think what we've put together is a really exciting path forward for our region to tackle climate change while also maximizing the co-benefits for our community. And with that, Kristen, I know what I was supposed to say. As you go, as questions come up, please put those in the chat before you forget them. We may, kind of depending on the timing and how we're doing with time, we may stop as we go, address some of those questions, especially if they're quick ones. Others we may save until after the presentation portion is finished. We do want to make sure you have a chance to ask questions, but just so we don't lose track of those, go ahead and write them in the chat as they occur to you, and we will try to tackle them in an order and at a time that makes sense. All right, Kristen, did I do my job?
Great job as always.
All right, then I'm going to pass it off to Brady.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your evening tonight to join us for this presentation. And thank you in advance for those who are going to submit comments. My name is Brady Ferguson, and I'm Director of Public Engagement with the Climate Solutions Accelerator of the Genesee-Finger Lakes region. I also want to say thank you to Dave and other members of our steering committee who helped with the development of this climate action strategy, and also those who participated in focus groups. I see a few here like Alan, Pat, Clement, and if there's someone I missed, sorry, I don't see everyone on my screen, but a lot of people have played a part in this all coming together. As far as what got this started, a lot of it is due to New York State's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed in 2019, or for short, some people just call it the New York State's Climate Law. But at the time, and still today in many ways, the most ambitious climate action legislation at the state level in our country. And you can see here some of the different provisions of this law. But what we want to do with this, with our collective impact work and with this regional climate action strategy, the long-term goal is meeting the goals of New York CLCPA right here in our 9-county Genesee-Finger Lakes region, including the longer-term goal of getting to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Also, and very importantly, making sure that at least 35 to 40% of the benefits of this transition away from fossil fuels go to environmental justice or disadvantaged communities, depending on how the name that people use. And you can also see some other steps along the way that are going to get us there as far as these longer term goals. Next slide, please. Now, we decided that we wanted to take a regional approach to climate action, keeping those state level goals in mind, but thought, well, why don't we take those goals and determine right here at the regional level how we can meet them and do so in a way that meets our community needs across our region. Because not all parts of New York State are the same, but we, the people of the Genesee-Finger Lakes region, we know best what's needed in our region and what is going to fit best. So we thought that regional approach would be good. And looking across our region at all 9 counties, we do have a lot of things we share, like the climate geography, the grid, the transportation infrastructure, as well as different organizations and regional bodies like the RGRTA operates across the region. The Finger Lakes Regional Economic Development Council works across this same 9-county region. And we just thought this was the right fit in terms of not too big, not too small, but looking at right at that regional level where it's enough to, what we do as a region will have a meaningful impact on the missions of our state. It'll make a meaningful, measurable difference there. But also it's a small enough region where we can be engaging local actors and local municipalities. And so we thought it was that right in the middle fit. So that's why we wanted to take this regional approach. Next slide. Just to give a little more background information on this idea of collective impact, it's being used across the country and actually in other different parts of the world to address very complex problems, basically a problem that can't be solved by any one organization or within any one single sector. It really requires collaboration across sectors to solve these complex problems. And we thought that this type of approach would really be necessary for climate change because it is one of those complex problems that can't just be solved within any one single sector, and it requires those larger systemic solutions. So that's why we decided to take this collective impact approach to regional climate action. So we brought together stakeholders from different sectors, and we formed our steering committee, including many of these different stakeholders from different sectors. And as we've been going through this process, we've been working to develop a common understanding of the problem or problems that we're dealing with, and also a common agenda, a shared system of measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, and making sure that we're just continuously communicating with each other. That's the only way it's going to work. So if you just look at the little diagram in the bottom right there, the idea is that if we can get everyone moving in the same direction, and each organization or stakeholder, wherever they are, can stay in their own lane, they don't have to go outside of what they would be doing anyways. But if we're all moving the same direction with a shared vision, it's going to lead to accelerated progress, and in this case on climate change and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So we did launch our Genesee-Finger Lakes Climate Collective, and you can see here the co-chairs and the different organizations that were represented on and this is our initial steering committee. We first convened the steering committee a little more than a year ago, back in February 2021. And this was after going back a year before that, going through this series of conversations with different stakeholders, having 100 cups of coffee, and then it became 200, 300, I don't know how many cups of coffee Kristen drank, but it was a lot of coffee. The point is, though, there are a lot of stakeholder meetings that were involved in figuring out how to do this and figuring out who would be the people we could ask to be on the steering committee. And we were very fortunate to have all these different organizations represented on our steering committee. And the members of the committee have been working since February of last year on developing this initial regional climate action strategy. And also, I should also mention that there's another organization, the Stockholm Environment Institute, or SEI, that we've been working with as well and have contracted with them to do a lot of the data work related to this, because having the right data is also a very important part of this. And my colleague Omar is going to talk more about that later. But as far as this this strategy, we're looking at a shorter term 3 to 5 year strategy. We thought that would be what we wanted to focus on initially, and really thinking about what are going to be those key enablers of longer term systemic changes. So what can we do in a shorter term to enable those longer term systemic changes, making sure to include actions that we know we already have to take, technologies that have already been proven to be effective. And also, very importantly, we want to maximize co-benefits for the community by addressing the cross-cutting considerations that you can see here in the little diagram on the right. So as far as co-benefits, we mean, what are those benefits in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Because that right there, it's a benefit itself, but what are other benefits and how can we maximize those? And we're trying to hit that sweet spot right in the middle of that quadruple Venn diagram, or whatever you call that. But those cross-cutting considerations are economic development, equity, public health, ecological stewardship, and those are all very important. So we have those in mind as well with this strategy. Next slide. So here's an overview of the process that we've gone through starting from over a year ago. But we did start with looking at what are the impacts of climate change around our region. How does it impact different sectors like health, like agriculture? And we, well, with the help of SEI, came out with a series of fact sheets about climate change in our region. Also, with the help of SEI, we did last year a regional greenhouse gas emissions baseline inventory. Because if we're going to eliminate these greenhouse gas emissions, first we have to figure out where they are coming from. So we did that inventory, presented it publicly, it went through a review process as well. And then we've been doing a lot of stakeholder engagement around this work, including sharing the results of this inventory, but a series of focus groups we did last summer and into the fall, a series of visioning focus groups. We did, well, actually, there's more of that on the next slide, but I also, just before we go to that one, I'll mention there's also been this scenario analysis that we have been doing most recently, and with the help of SEI, developing these scenarios, looking ahead to the future, and how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and what will be the impact of different greenhouse gas mitigation measures, and that has informed the development of this strategy. Next slide. As far as the stakeholder engagement that I was starting to get into there, we've been working to do a lot of that and making, this is really a crucial part of this whole process. But as you saw earlier, we have over 18 different organizations represented on the steering committee, and members of the steering committee have really helped a lot with doing the stakeholder engagement and helping us connect with people we probably otherwise could not have done. We had a lot of stakeholder meetings, focus groups, individual conversations with different organizations. We did a survey last year that got over 400 unique responses. We also have had over 100 participants in a series of visioning focus groups we did last summer. And then just over the past couple months, we've done some additional focus groups looking at the mitigation measures in this strategy, and then also just looking at earlier drafts of the strategy itself. Trying to understand what are perceptions around climate change and climate action. What are those barriers to different climate solutions? And so some of those focus groups were very sector specific and trying to find experts in certain sectors like agriculture, like health, like renewable energy generation, like people who work with equity focused organizations. So we did those, but also some of the focus groups were more population specific, like we did one with rural community residents, urban Black community residents, urban Latino community residents, farm workers focus group, and indigenous community focus group. So trying to make sure to engage with different populations, different communities, and also trying to prioritize groups that have been more marginalized, and then especially groups that will be more impacted by climate change and already are being more impacted. And of course, we plan for our stakeholder and public engagement to be ongoing. Next slide. And this is where I turn it over to Omar.
Thank you, Brady, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Omar Aponte, as Brady already mentioned, and I'm the data manager for the Climate Solutions Accelerator. And as Brady mentioned before, we've been working with the Stockholm Environmental Institute on putting together this greenhouse gas emissions inventory for our region. And what we're looking at here is where are our emissions coming when we look at them by sector. And it is important to point out that in order to get all these results, we have followed the most recent guidance from both international agencies, such as the IPCC, but we've also prioritized guidance from local agencies and local documents, such as the New York State Emissions Inventory, and also the guidelines established by the COCPA. The key takeaways from this graph is basically that the majority of our emissions is coming from the transportation sector with 34%, then following up with agriculture and forestry, and then going into buildings. So those are like three major areas where we have emissions in our region. Next slide, please. When we look at it by county, though, we see that Monroe County is the one that contributes the most to these emissions. However, as we can see on the table on the right, that doesn't mean that Monroe County is the only county that has to work on reducing emissions. If we see the comparison, when we look at emissions per capita, actually Wyoming County is 6.4 when we look at million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And this is times 10 to the 5. And as we can see, there's a disparity there in regards of who emits the most, but then also who emits the most per capita. So what we can see here is that every county basically has a big piece of responsibility when it comes to our mitigation measures. And if we actually now look at county and sector, which is the next slide, we can see also how for each county, the sector varies. So if we take a look at Monroe again, we see that the biggest share of emissions come from transportation, followed by buildings, both commercial and residential. However, if we look at a county like Wyoming or a county like Yates, we see how the biggest contributions to emissions come from the agricultural and forestry sector. So basically what we're trying to say here is that even though we are looking at it from a regional perspective, we also recognize that every county will have a different strategy to follow. Next slide, please. In this slide, what we see is the energy burden by income and by county. And just to give a little background and a little benchmark, the New York State Energy Affordability Policy states that low-income households should not be paying more than 6% of their income on energy. And as we can see in this graph throughout our region, that very low-income population is paying way higher than that 6%. And this is to bring us to the point where we think, as we are thinking about these solutions to reduce emissions, we also have to think about the things like energy affordability and all those other co-benefits that Brady mentioned before, because we need to ensure that whatever policies, whatever measures we endorse do not put additional pressure on those living in poverty. Next slide, please. So part of the scenario analysis that we did, we developed three basic scenarios. We developed one scenario where we were just looking at the existing policy that we have at a state and also federal level. Then we look at those existing policy plus what we consider low ambition targets based on scoping plans and other plans in the region. And then we look at existing policies with higher ambition targets. And what we can see in this graph is how we perform in each of those scenarios. So on the top, we see how do we perform when we look at ourselves in 2030, where we have a COCPA target of reducing 40% of the emissions that we had in 1990. As we can see here, only an existing policy and high ambition target gets us to that point in 2030. However, when we look to the three bottom lines, those are the targets in 2050. And we can see there that even with a high ambition target, there's still a lot of emissions that we need to reduce. So basically what this tells us is that we need to perform swift and equitable and also aggressive action to target these regional emissions. And the key takeaways from this is that, as you can see in both the top and the bottom set of lines, the existing policy doesn't get us where we need to be. So we need to actually go into discussing high ambition targets for our region. Our next slide. So in this slide, we take a deeper look at that high ambition scenario. And this is specifically looking at 2050. And here we see an example of some of the mitigation measures that we have explored. And these mitigation measures have come from those focus groups that Brady mentioned, also from looking at other existing literature and plans that we have from other cities, from other counties, also scientific literature that we have looked at, and also comparative study cases. And the key takeaway from this is that we have major opportunities to reduce emissions when we look at the transportation sector, the building sector, and the agricultural sector. And to take a little deeper look at these mitigation measures, I'm going to turn it back to Brady now.
Actually, Omar, before we switch, we have a good question in the chat from Jennifer asking about the impact, if we can tease out the impact of the health system as an emitter in our region, given that they are sort of a major sector in our region. Can you speak a little bit about what we are or are not able to do on that?
So at this moment, the level of data that we don't have data that relates specifically to the health system, so to the healthcare system. So for example, we don't specifically have the energy demand that specifically relates to the health system or the waste production of the health system. But that will be an interesting point that we can take a look at in the future, definitely.
Thanks, Omar. I also saw that Alan pointed out in the chat that there are a lot of CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, if I have that acronym right, in Wyoming County. But yeah, I think he's right about that. And from, excuse me, seems that's playing a big role in agriculture, accounting for a big chunk of those Wyoming County emissions. But here are the mitigation measures in the bigger categories of mitigation measures that are going into this regional climate action strategy, or that are in the draft version of it. As Omar was saying, these came out of the modeling that he and SEI have been working on, looking ahead to 2050 and what's going to get us where we need to go. But once again, as I mentioned earlier, we really are focusing on the shorter term, next 3 to 5 years. What do we know has to be done? What's already been shown to be effective? And how can we lay that groundwork for those longer term systemic changes? So these mitigation measures were selected based on focus group feedback that we got with all the focus groups we did. We also did a lot of work with our staff and also some great volunteers we had doing research, looking at other plans already in place around the region, comprehensive plans and transportation plans, climate action plans, looking at all of those and looking for best practices, what was common in those different plans. And also and then considering where our emissions are coming from here, looking at what type of measures fit with the sources here. A big part of it, we decided, or we feel like a big part of it needs to be renewable energy generation, because decarbonizing the electrical grid is going to produce year-over-year gains as we electrify other sectors. So there's that renewable energy generation goes together with, it's important because it's going to have an impact across other sectors. And the faster we can reach a clean energy grid, then the larger impact we can have in those other sectors. And also just mention that a lot of what we put in here is not new that we invented or came up with, but it's things that we know are already being done. They're already part of other plans, and we tried to look for those actions that already have broad support. Regarding that grid decarbonization, a long-term vision is to have a 100% clean, renewable energy grid that's reliable, resilient, and affordable. So some mitigation measures going into that grid decarbonization. First, educating local municipalities and residents about the costs and benefits of renewable energy projects of varying types, could be wind, solar, for example, the impacts on local environments and communities, and the process for navigating strong community benefits agreements. And as an example in the strategy, we have an example of Mount Morris and the Morridge Ridge solar project there. Also facilitate a community conversation on the role of nuclear, hydrogen, and biogas in the local energy mix. Some of these, I mean, these are already being used, but people really need to talk about it and figure out what is the right role for these currently, but also thinking ahead to the future. Participate in rate cases to advocate for grid reliability, equitable rate design, and programming that encourages electrification. Drive rooftop solar installations through coordination of resources for local incentives and service providers, also using some type of energy navigators program to help people with putting these on their roofs. And we really want to see some type of pilot or proof of concept for 3 renewable energy projects of different types, like community solar, microgrid, or something like agrivoltaics. We're combining solar farm and agriculture on the same land. Just as examples of what these type of pilot project might be. Next slide. Transportation, of course, is huge. Actually, the biggest source of emissions in our region. Now, our long-term vision is for environmentally sustainable, convenient, reliable, affordable, safe, and comfortable forms of transport with all electric public transportation and improved walk and bikeability. And of course, we're trying to avoid that blind spot in terms of thinking about transportation and prioritizing first reducing vehicle miles traveled, because the fewest emissions come from a vehicle that doesn't travel at all. Part of that is going to be for more funding for RGRTA's operations budget, advocating that federal and state infrastructure funding can be used to expand broadband infrastructure, which could have a lot of benefits, but one would be more people being able to work from home and not needing to travel in that vehicle as often. Support the implementation of an interconnected regional network of strategically placed trails that cross municipal boundaries. And when we talk to folks, we learn more about how this is already being done, like with the Trail Towns initiative, but really supporting further implementation of that. Local municipalities can pursue New York State climate smart communities or clean energy community certification. And through these programs, there are a lot of different actions that communities can take and earn points. And then when they earn enough points, they can qualify for grant money from New York State through the Department of Environmental Conservation, as well as NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. But through these programs, they can earn points and get grant money to then take additional action on being climate smart and promoting clean energy. And included in the actions that can be taken are things like complete street policies, safe routes to schools, and biking and walking infrastructure. Also, another mitigation measure we have in the draft action strategy is ending investment of public funds for development projects that are not accessible by public transit. So really using the development funding for those projects that are accessible by public transit. Next slide. And Clement, thanks for stopping by. We do apologize for the conflicting time with Brighton's meeting, and we certainly understand it's very, very important for people to attend that as well. The next one with transportation is transitioning remaining vehicle miles traveled to zero emission vehicles, because we don't expect we can eliminate all vehicle miles traveled. Probably not realistic, but let's work on converting to zero emission vehicles for those vehicle miles that do have to be traveled. So advocating for more equitable rate design for off-hours EV charging, doing a pilot project or proof of concept for electric vehicle sharing or some type of electric shuttle service. And also there are climate smart communities and clean energy communities actions that involve implementing EV infrastructure. So we also want to encourage municipalities to take those actions. Next slide. And that brings us to housing and buildings, another key sector that we have to address. So the long-term vision for this section is well-maintained, affordable, and efficient housing that is heated and cooled with high-efficiency heat pumps and energy efficiency requirements for rental properties to reduce costs and improve home health. So first, some mitigation measures around increasing energy efficiency, or EE for short. Deploy energy navigators to conduct large-scale education and outreach efforts, especially for low to moderate income households and those most vulnerable to climate change impacts. One reason for that is because they're more likely to be eligible for the different programs and incentives. A lot of those are income-based. But also, Omar showed the data earlier on energy burden, and there could be multiple benefits to improving energy efficiency for low-income households when they're also reducing their energy burden. So we're looking for those win-win type situations. In addition, streamline application processes for energy efficiency programs and develop processes to braid funding for EE work. There are more opportunities for climate smart communities and clean energy communities here, with building efficiency action items like building benchmarking, which can go beyond public buildings, and also the adoption of stretch codes, which are building energy codes that are a little more stringent, so encouraging those. And also looking for minimum energy standards for rental properties in places like the city of Rochester, where the majority of households are renters. We think it really is crucial to include some type of action specifically addressing rental properties, where that split incentive with the renter paying the utility while the landlord paying for property type upgrades like energy efficiency upgrades, that just dealing with that makes it a little harder. So really finding a way we can target rental properties is important. Next slide. Next, related to building electrification. We want to educate residents and raise awareness about heat pumps, advocate for more equitable rate design for building electrification, a pilot project or proof of concept for 3 district or community geothermal projects with varying ownership models, and hopefully find something that works well and that can then be scaled up. We'd like to sunset gas in new construction sooner than Governor Hochul's 2027 goal, and then phase out system replacements in existing buildings by 2028. So if someone has a gas furnace in their building that needs to be replaced, get it replaced with a heat pump and electric system. We want to identify 2 local lenders to pilot innovative financing strategies, for example, 0 to low interest financing or gap funding, to overcome upfront cost barriers. That's really huge barrier, because over time, electrifying and doing energy efficiency work on homes will save the homeowner money over the long term, but there's that big upfront expense. So it's a challenge we have to work to overcome. And also ending investment of public funds for development projects that use gas. Phasing out gas and electrifying is important. Next slide, please. Next category is food and agriculture and land use. Grouping these sectors together, a lot of relationships between them. So the long-term vision is agricultural lands and livelihoods that are protected from climate change impacts and remain productive and resilient. So this first set of mitigation measures here is focused on improving soil health and reducing agricultural waste. Advocate for and support reliable, accessible, and locally relevant data on farming emissions and potential for carbon sequestration. It's definitely something that came out of our discussions with people who work in agriculture, and it really being a tricky sector to measure, when every farmer could be doing something a little bit different on their land. So just getting a better sense of how it all fits together. So getting better data on that. Also raising awareness about the impact of dietary choices on regional emissions, facilitating community conversations with farmers and farm experts about the challenges and opportunities associated with agricultural production and climate change, increasing peer-to-peer farmer education on benefits of soil health practices, a pilot or proof of concept for community composting systems, including municipal, residential, and institutional settings, advocate for payment for ecosystem services and other incentivization mechanisms that support adoption of soil health practices, and also increasing financial resources for farmers to implement manure management practices, including grants and no to low cost financing mechanisms. Next slide, please. Next, for related to this category here, next section is on improving access to locally sourced food and community green space. Advocate for or organize an increase in community green space, tree plantings, community gardens, urban agriculture, and other beautification efforts. Also, identify 2 local large institutions that will commit to transitioning their procurement strategies to locally sourced, organic, plant-based foods and regeneratively grown meat, with preferential contracts for farmers who are employing soil health practices. Next slide. And then we have what we call our miscellaneous or economy-wide category, because we felt like there are other actions that have to be taken outside those 4 main categories there. So just for now, just grouping them all into this economy-wide category. But the long-term vision here is to cultivate a regenerative local economy that invests in local people and communities while sustaining the Earth's natural resources. First, these mitigation measures are related to building resilient communities. Commission a study to project long-term population trends and corresponding implications for our local economy, especially in regards to housing and transportation. Build citizen support and capacity for climate action, especially organizing and mobilizing citizens across our region. Getting local municipalities to pursue climate smart communities and clean energy communities certification and implement relevant action items. You probably recall some of those are mentioned in related to other sectors like transportation, as well as buildings. But through these programs, there's all kinds of different actions that are part of them. Commission a clean energy workforce development study focused on projected growth and local needs assessment. Advocate for and coordinate a nonprofit clean energy workforce development training center that targets traditionally underserved communities. And advocate for an economy-wide carbon pricing system that is built with an equity focus. Next slide. And that brings us to the end of me talking about those different mitigation measures. So before we move on, I don't know, I saw there's some things in the chat, but what questions do we have?
Would we invite people then to just speak up? If you don't want to put your question in the chat, feel free to just raise your voice or your little digital hand. We'll call on you.
I have read through the strategy and I was very impressed, especially with the examples that you had. The farm, in, I forgot where it was, and, all that. How are you planning to get this beyond these many faces I see in front of me and, get it out there? I'm thinking of my own community. I live in Williamson, Wayne County, and so much of what I just heard of the climate, the community is like to get that out there.
Thank you, Carol, for that question. And that's really, it's crucial to get this out there and to get people around our region to take ownership of it, because we as the Climate Solutions Accelerator, and even with different members of our steering committee, we are not in a position of power where we can just like mandate this for anyone. So we need people to want to get it adopted in their community. So once we launch this strategy, we're going to be moving into the implementation phase and have an implementation steering committee and different work groups that are going to guide this implementation effort. But a lot of that is going to involve education, finding different ways to engage the communities around our region with learning about the strategy or whatever parts of it are most relevant to their community, and helping people in Williamson or in Brighton or wherever with taking the pieces that are most important and fit best with their community, and then getting it implemented in their community, and getting their community to become clean energy community or climate smart community, or if they already are, continuing to take those actions, especially the ones that fit in with this. So I think that's really crucial that we do that, but we're gonna have it's really going to continue to involve a lot of engagement of people across our region, and education on the strategy, and finding ways where we can work together with people on it. Abby, Kristen, anything else you want to add on that one?
Only that we'll be telling you about our Climate Solutions Summit a little later, and hope that you'll participate and encourage your community leaders to participate. And there'll be a pledge. So we got some other things we're going to talk about later, but that was just the teaser. Tim, I think your hand went up first.
Thanks. Just a question on the process here. So I don't have a question, but I do have some comments, and I'm wondering when might be the most appropriate time to share those. I've just got some ideas in terms of the question that was just asked about launching and about communicating the strategy. And so I just want to get some direction in terms of when I might share some of those thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. So what we want to do is just take questions first, as far as if anyone needs clarification on anything, or maybe something that will inform comments that people have to make. And then actually we already have a order for people to make comments as far as who signed up first to make comments. And then once we're through that list, then we'll open up to anyone to make comments. Is it okay? Can we come back to you for the comment, Tim?
Of course, sure.
Okay, yeah, so just questions for now, and then we'll move on to the comments portion of the meeting. So
Thanks, man.
Stephen, do you have a question?
I do. It really relates to the representation on the steering committee to start with, but then it's followed up with a couple of other questions. It was flashed fairly quickly, and I'm afraid I didn't see it when I read the report, but how many municipalities were represented as part of the steering committee, or governments in general?
So on the steering committee, we did not have any elected officials on the steering committee. We did have people who lived in a lot of different municipalities across the region, but considering that we have nine counties, we have in total 189 municipalities, we didn't really go the route of trying to get like elected officials from every single municipality. Kristen, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think, it became a question about fairness and representation and size, with the understanding that we would, and to Linda, I believe's question or follow-up question in the chat, right, about different ways that we as both steering committee members, working group members, and we're calling them citizen action teams, will go out to engage the various municipal and elected officials. And I don't know that we necessarily have made a decision about, whether or not to change our minds on that representation on the next phase of the steering committee, just because, as Brady pointed out, there's just so many. So we're still sort of like working through the logistics on, how to best represent the voices, but also be fair and equitable, and making sure we're not shortchanging any, leaving any particular community out. So it's been something that we've, had a lot of conversations about, and we've struggled with the best approach.
Given that a lot of this involves policy as well as funding, it's a concern to me that we need to have that voice, and getting it front and center is going to be critical to any kind of collective action across the Finger Lakes.
We did, I don't think either of you mentioned this, Kristen or Brady, correct, forgive me if I'm restating something, but we did actually have some focus groups specifically for municipal leaders. So although they weren't invited to be part of the steering committee, although Dave points out he is on the town board of Barrington and he's on our steering committee, it was an intentional choice not to invite people to be representatives of the municipalities on the steering committee. Yes, Dave, we are very happy to have you, even though you are technically an elected official. Just because there was no way to include everyone, and we didn't want to, pick and choose in a way that would feel unfair, but we did have other opportunities for municipal leaders to weigh in, and we'll of course continue to engage them. Pat.
I have the question of how will direction directly to, for example, Monroe County be managed if each town is struggling to do something like composting? It's really a bigger worldwide, well, countywide project or problem. Will you be aiming recommendations directly to the county?
We will not, especially because we do have, 9 counties, and there's going to be different strategies needed to reach the different stakeholders in those 9 counties. So
it's up to us?
It is largely up to, yes, it is up to us collectively, the big us.
Okay.
And also it will be, that will largely fall under, onto the working groups to kind of dig into those specific strategies.
Working groups. Okay.
Yes, so following the public introduction of this strategy, we will be forming those working groups that will be looking at the, the specific sectors and digging into the real, okay, now like, how do we do this? So recognizing that there is going to be difference from municipality to municipality, or county to county. We didn't want to get too prescriptive, overly prescriptive. And so we were looking to find that balance between guidance and direction, but still leaving room for creativity and, kind of an on the ground experience of people who know how best to engage in their communities.
Thank you.
Evan.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. My question is a little bit more specific. Everybody knows I'm now obsessed for life with geothermal HVAC. And one of the things I've learned is that many rural communities don't even have access to natural gas infrastructure, and that many of those use oil and propane to heat their homes, usually at a very, very high expense. Now, these rural areas also are technically easier for geothermal installs than others because of the space, but I also appreciate that focusing on rural conversion to geothermal might not make a great strategic sense, given that the overall number of them is smaller than the ones who are on gas infrastructure. So I'm trying to, one of the things as I was reading the strategy is, should there be more focus on these rural communities and their heating, the potential for geothermal or not, and why or why not?
Kristen, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take it? Brady?
Maybe that's too specific for this forum, but that's what was on my mind.
So I'll start, and then Abby, you can follow up, because I'm sure I'll leave some things out. But, Evan, I think you're right to point out, I think what we want to do, and this ties in with the education campaigns and like reaching and discussing the clean energy community campaign, clean energy communities and climate smart communities campaign, is customer educate or residential education prior to somebody making the switch from their systems from propane and gas, or propane and oil, to natural gas. Like, that is the opportunity there to really have a big impact. And supposedly in the last utility rate case, one of the things that we advocated for quite forcefully was a commitment from the utility to quit looking for their looking for opportunities for expansion of the gas infrastructure into those areas, and instead propose electrification as a way to address those heating needs. And then somewhat tied to that is we have been, I will say, speaking on behalf of the Accelerator and not necessarily on behalf of the Climate Collective, we've been a part of the Renewable Heat Now campaign, which is looking to, that is supporting the Gas Transition and Affordability Act, I believe it's called. And the idea is to phase out the, as you well know, the 100-foot rule that requires that ratepayers subsidize the first 100 feet of gas infrastructure. And that would essentially disincentivize financially customers in rural areas who are looking, you know, to replace their oil and gas system, because they would have to essentially make the, you know, make up those costs. The tricky thing about the rural areas is that it's not as well suited for those district systems that we said it would be great to pilot, unless we were looking in sort of more concentrated downtown areas. And then wouldn't that be fabulous to have, you know, a small downtown Main Street, you know, have a district system. But in terms of the opportunities for sort of neighborhood level district systems, I think that starts to reduce in terms of its overall benefits. I'm sure I left something out. So if Abby or Brady or Omar want to jump in.
No, I would just say, you know, from an energy burden perspective, an equity perspective, getting people off of oil and propane is not just good for the climate, you know, it's good for for energy affordability. So yes, making sure those people know that geothermal is an option and have access to the programs and incentives that can help them make that switch. That definitely needs to be a priority, but also just end of life of systems in general. We don't want people to replace whatever kind of system they have. If they have a natural gas system, like that is the time to make the switch to a heat pump of some sort or another, ideally, rather than replace it with a new gas system. So targeting the right customers at the right time is something we need to be thinking about, and something that, you know, NYSERDA does offer some support to help communities do. Some of what was in the strategy about improving the systems to streamline programs that would support that kind of work. Did that answer the question, Evan?
Oh, yes, very thoroughly. I appreciate that, because I know some of this is coming back to me because we had discussed it before, but I found myself thinking again about the pros and cons of this rural reality and whether there's few enough of them that we need to focus maybe in other areas, but there's an opportunity and a necessity there. So I was feeling a little conflicted. So I was wondering what you thought. Thank you.
At the end of the day, we need to get all our heating systems off of fossil fuels. So, okay, I think maybe we're ready to transition to our official, you know, public comment period. Is that right?
Sounds good to me, unless any other questions, not comments, but any other questions before we move on to the comments?
Okay. I will pull up our one slide just so you can see it here.
Yep, so we just have this to just explain our procedure for how we're planning to do this tonight. Of course, anyone is invited to submit comments or suggestions, and we will call individuals based on the registration order. And I'll mention that now, just so you know who's on deck and who's in the hole. But we have Evan Lowenstein is first, and then after that, we have Tim McGowan. And then after that, we'll just open it up to anyone else who wants to go after that. You can use the raise hand function. But to allow time for everyone to speak, we ask that you please limit your comments to 3 minutes, and we'll be keeping time. We're here to listen and take note of the comments. We're not necessarily going to respond to them, but we'll be listening, taking note, and any public input and comments that we receive is going to guide the action that we take, even if it doesn't explicitly get incorporated into the latest written version of the document. I just want to mention that as an example, in a focus group we did, someone suggested we have some type of tactical roadmap and a way for, as a way of identifying priorities among these different mitigation measures. Like, okay, we do this, and then strategically, that's going to take us to this next, and this next, and this next, which I thought was a great idea. But also considering what Abby was saying earlier, as far as like, you know, telling a certain county what to do. Each county is different. Each city, town, village, hamlet could be different. So that tactical roadmap could be different for each community. So we don't want to dictate that, but we want to leave a little flexibility in there. So we thought there's a good suggestion will be incorporated as we work on implementing it, but it's not going to be included in this written document because, like we were saying, we don't want it to be overly prescriptive. So that's just an example for you there. And also, we do have a form, online form for anyone to submit written comments. So you're welcome to do that as well. We'll put that in the chat. We're welcome to do that today, tomorrow. We'll be keeping that form open. And then just once again, if there is time remaining after Evan and Tim, which there will be plenty of time, then we invite others who would like to comment but did not register in advance. Now, let me ask, are we going to be recording the comments as well?
Kristen, I'm looking at you.
Well, I was gonna ask if we recorded them, if we could edit them out for when we posted it. So just for the sake of, you know, safe space, and feel free to say whatever you want. You don't have to worry about being online, but yeah. So I guess we could stop and restart. It probably might be easier than editing.